can you all hear me?
Yep, we hear you.
All right. Good afternoon, good morning. On my side, I'm in Seattle, joining you all. I know we're all a little zoomed out during this pandemic, but it is a nice opportunity to join you guys from all the way on the other side of the world. So let me start this presentation. So I was able to catch just a little bit of the last presentation, and I've heard so many great things about Influencer Hub, so I'm really excited to be with you guys today and talk to you a little bit about what influencers and journalists can learn from each other. So when I was looking at putting this presentation together, I realized that this is the third talk I've given on influencers, which tells you a lot about the importance of individual content creators online. And I really think of anybody with a smartphone and a social media account as a micro publisher. And so from the perspective of journalists who have been doing this publishing thing for a long time, I think there's lots we can learn, especially as we think about building an information ecosystem that creates more of the world we want to live in. So let's just all acknowledge that during this pandemic, we've all been spending way more time with our devices, on our laptops, phones, than we would normally. And that's both sort of an opportunity and a challenge for those of us who are digital publishers. So, here's some hard data to look at. McKinsey and Company, which is a consulting firm, took a look at the digital adaptation, and you can see this dark bar shows just the jump in digital adoption over the year of the pandemic. And what that means for those of us who live and work online is that increasingly this is the world that everyone is inhabiting. People are getting their information here, people are going here, and that's an opportunity for us to be creating and shaping that world. Another thing that has changed during the pandemic, which I think is really interesting, this is from a communications firm called Edelman. So if you look at this chart, you see that the change over the past year has really increased people's feeling and need for media and information literacy and science literacy. And also, since we're talking about social good, look here down at the bottom, speaking out when I see the need for change and reforms. So all of this is connected to people feeling increasingly the need for good information that they can rely upon to make decisions about their lives and to speak out on issues that they find important. Again, this is an opportunity for people who are telling stories, either influencers, journalists, online, and it's an opportunity that tells us that there's people who are hungry for this. And I think there's a really concrete reason why. During the pandemic, those of us who work in the information space, we've been talking about this issue forever, this idea that the information we consume really helps, really is, so important in the real world. And during the pandemic, that became, completely obvious in really tangible ways. So if you look at this is also from Edelman, and what it shows is this gap in between the people who are planning to get the vaccine and the people who are not so sure about that. And you see this gap is huge all around the world between the people who have what they call good information hygiene and not so good information hygiene. And obviously, the decision to get the vaccine or not is going to greatly impact the course of the pandemic globally. So that's a real tangible thing. And that's, I think, part of what's driving people to realize that information and having access to good information is so important. So, in a micro way, we've seen this influencer information effect as it relates to the vaccines. So, I've been seeing some posts from my friends in Ukraine who have been getting the vaccine. In the US, we now have about 50% of the population vaccinated. And in the early stages of the vaccine campaign, there was a big push to ask for individual people, share your stories of the vaccine, because as we saw before, there's this hesitancy. And we've heard from the experts who say, here's how the vaccine was developed, here's why it's safe. And then there's this next level of communication that is from individuals, people publishing things on their own platforms and really just sharing those individual experiences in a way that can be closer to home, more intimate, and more connected. But also, and this is key, it really needs to be reliable information. And I'm going to get to this next, but I think one of the things that we all need to think about is whether we have a following that's in, the single, triple, six digits. Everything that we do online is really an act of publishing and can have all kinds of consequences. So, for instance, in the US, a number of people were posting their vaccine pictures. Obviously, I was not, I got in on the trend as well. That's me after my second dose. But then there started to be some conversation around, well, wait a minute, like how much information should you really share? How safe is it to share that information? And I think this micro example points at this broader topic that we all need to think through, which is that everything we publish is going to have an impact one way or another. And that's something that journalists can really bring to the conversation, as journalists and influencers are speaking about their experiences in the world of creating and publishing stories online. So I mentioned some of the opportunities that exist for digital publishing. Here's some of the challenges. So people know they need reliable information. People want this information. People see how important reliable information is, especially in the pandemic. But this is also from Edelman. You see that there's a lack of trust across all of these sectors. I have some questions about what they mean about social media here. Do they mean platforms themselves? Do they mean broadly what people feel about the content there? But I think what's important to understand is that while there are opportunities and there's audiences hungry for this stuff, there's challenges too. And trust is difficult to gain and easy to lose. And whether you're a big publisher or an individual brand, you need to always be thinking about that trust factor. And that gets at this other idea that even the small things that we do online are an act of publishing and can impact this one way or another. So as I mentioned, when I was preparing for this talk, I realized, yeah, this is the third talk I've given on influencers. And I looked back at some of my other talks and realized that this emoji slide still holds true. So I think influencers have a lot of things going for them that are more difficult for traditional journalists. One of those is this unicorn emoji, that is voice. So a lot of times influencers may start with something that's very personal to them, something that they're interested in, food, music, fashion, and they're building an audience from that. So from the very beginning, their individual voice is baked in. Sometimes this can be a struggling point for traditional journalism, but we see in the new ways of communication, so much of the communication is very intimate via our devices, through our earbuds, and that voice and that intimacy is really key to building an audience and trust. Influencers also are able to play with humor in really effective ways. So humor is one of these things in communication. it releases good feeling emotions in the mind and the body and helps create connection. And humor is something that traditional journalists definitely struggle to incorporate. It's not as easy a fit, but especially if you look at places like TikTok, you see a lot of influencers and publishers really playing with humor and building audiences and connections in that way. The final thing is, I think influencers are really good at pulling back the curtain and showing the journey, showing how things get made, showing different parts of the whole story in a way that really kind of like fosters that connection. And that's something that, again, is not as natural for journalists. You know, especially for something like investigative journalism, it would be practically impossible to be telling those backstories. So those are some of the advantages. Some of the disadvantages, you know, we've all seen this meme, Instagram versus reality, right? So we have the beautiful travel photo on the one side, and then we have the reality. And this really speaks to something that we've seen develop as the power and strength of social publishing and influencers has grown, is really this feeling of the picture that I'm getting from my favorite accounts on these social platforms is really rosy. And is that really the reality? And I think that's a challenge to really take seriously, because what can happen is, you know, for instance, I polled my followers to ask them what's the impression they get of my life based on my social platforms, more so Facebook and Instagram. And, you know, it was like basically all rosy. It was like travel. It was like someone who's in control, someone who's, you know, all of these things. And of course, that's only one piece of the story. And when people are only getting the rosy parts, they may feel very lonely and isolated because they don't see the problems and the struggles that are also part of everyone's life. So that's something to really keep in mind as we're building this ecosystem, again, for social good, or more towards this world we all want to live in. We want more connection, not people feeling lonely, right? Okay, so some lessons from traditional media. So these emojis, when I was building this presentation, I realized weren't quite as fun as the influencer ones, but I think they're really important. So the first one is about really strong ethical framework and guidelines. So every newsroom in the US will have some kind of ethical framework and guidelines. Some of these are consistent throughout. Everything has to be true. Obviously, it's journalism. It's facts. For instance, there's a strong norm. You would never pay for an interview. You would never let someone see a piece before it publishes, because editorial control rests with the journalists. And this framework is really helpful as you're building a brand and you're building that reputation, and people are coming back to you because they trust you in these different ways. Another thing that every journalistic outlet will have is a plan for correcting errors. Unfortunately, we're human, errors do happen. And when they do, it can be very stressful. And to have a plan for how you're going to handle that error really takes you out of the emotional stress of that moment and allows you to make the important decisions that you need to make to repair any damage and continue to be a trusted source. And again, whether that's food, fashion, hard news, there's going to be mistakes, and trust is always a foundation. The final one I want to touch on is a strong editing culture. And this just means, like, for instance, at CNN, nothing is ever going on air or online just from one person. There's always going to be someone else who has edited it, who has offered feedback, who has checked it to make sure it's right. And that's really important, even if you're publishing for smaller audiences, because even if one person is listening to you, you have influence. You're a giant in the minds of that person who's listening to you. And so it's really important to have that culture where somebody is able to take a second look. So if the criticism of social media broadly is that it's too rosy, I found this cartoon to be apropos of the criticism of traditional media, which often looks at what's happening in society from the problem perspective. Journalists will shine a light on a problem that's happening because there's a feeling that the public needs to know about this problem. And, I think that is also something that we all need to be mindful of because, again, that's one piece of the story of our reality and of our time, right? So, I was thinking about the opportunity to talk with you all. The work that we're all doing when we're social media publishing is really important, and it got me thinking about this talk that I heard from this man, John Amici. And as you can see, as on this book cover, he was a basketball player and is a tall guy, a big guy. And he told us this story that I think is really instructive for all of us as we go through our lives, and specifically as it relates to publishing. So when John was playing in NBA courts, there were a lot of people who were similar size to him. So, he's throwing elbows to get to the rim. That's part of his world. He told this story about being at a club and dancing and just having a great time and kind of forgetting himself and where he was, and realizing too late that he was so much bigger than so many of the people around him. And in dancing and just being unaware, he inadvertently really hurt someone who was nearby him and was smaller. And I think this story is really important because, as I said, even if one person is listening to you, you're a giant, and there is a responsibility that comes with that. I think it's especially worth keeping in mind in the digital world because sometimes, we're at home, we're in our pajamas, I'm joining you all from, a living room in Seattle, a dining room in Seattle. The connection and the reaction can feel a little bit disconnected, but the reality is that absolutely everything we do online has an impact. It just may not be immediately obvious. Here's a study that really gets at that point. So social media is still so new, and I know you've heard from a lot of folks who are doing really amazing research in this realm. Here's a study that got at the impact of just one like. How easy is it to click the like button on Twitter or Instagram or TikTok? It's so easy. And yet, even that can have tremendous impact. So what this study looked at is it looked at this piece of misinformation about Galapagos banning tourism. That wasn't true, but they had one trusted person like each one of these posts, and they presented them to see whether that one like would impact whether people believed it to be true. And it had a huge impact. And so what that means is that someone is following you and trusting you, and even something as small as liking might impact what they're thinking about the world around them. And I think it's really important just to have some of this early research as a touchstone as we're thinking about what we're doing and what stories we're telling in our own digital platforms. So, final slide, takeaways. I'm hoping you guys have some questions too. I love hearing what's on the minds of everyone else. But these are my takeaways for anybody who's doing any kind of publishing. The first is know your audience. Journalists will know this, whether it's a local audience, a domestic audience, an international audience, and that changes the way you're telling stories. So, for instance, for CNN telling a story about Ukraine, we're telling a story for the English-speaking audience globally. So we may be saying things about a situation there that would be very obvious to a Ukrainian audience. But our international audience might need that context to understand. So knowing your audience is critical. Understanding your core mission. Now, your core mission might change. So when CNN was founded, it was a cable network. Obviously not now, we're so much bigger than that. But knowing your core audience is really critical. Or I'm sorry, understanding your core mission is really critical because understanding your core mission it's like your touchstone, and that can change, as I mentioned, but it helps you decide what's in bounds and what's out of bounds. Having a plan for correcting mistakes, I mentioned that earlier, that gets you out of the stress and emotion of those moments. Have a routine plan for reliable feedback. This can be a small group of people, but people you trust. Have red lines. These are things that you just absolutely will not do. And this can be really important when you're just starting out, because as you grow bigger, you will have more opportunities. In that same vein, be ready to turn down money. That sounds kind of crazy, but it's really important. And remember, you are a giant. We are all giants. I kind of look like a giant in this screen with just my head, but all of us publishing are giants. And what we do really impacts the information ecosystems.